The prison clock had stopped ticking years ago. It wasn't broken. Everyone knew that. It had been deliberately silenced after an inmate smashed it during a riot, claiming the sound was driving him mad. Since then, time inside Blackwater Correctional Facility had been measured differently. By footsteps in the corridor, by meal trays sliding through metal slots, by the hum of fluorescent lights that never fully turned off. On the morning of the execution, the lights hummed louder than usual. Elias Crow sat on the edge of his narrow steel bed, hands folded, posture calm enough to unsettle the guards watching him through the reinforced glass. He was 34 years old, though stress and isolation had carved deeper lines into his face. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, his eyes sharp. Not desperate, not afraid. That was the first thing people would talk about later. He didn't look scared. The headlines would say, outside the prison walls, the world was busy with ordinary things. Commuters rushed to work. Children complained about school. Stock markets fluctuated. Somewhere, a birthday cake was being cut. Somewhere else, a war briefing was being prepared. And yet, at exactly 6 a.m., the life of Elias Crow was scheduled to end. He had been convicted 7 years earlier for the murder of Senator Harold Whitman, a political giant, a man with influence that stretched across borders. The trial had been fast, efficient, and highly publicized. Evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. Cameras captured every expression on Elias's face. The public had made up its mind long before the verdict. Guilty. Elias rose as the cell door opened with a mechanical groan. 2 guards stepped in, professional and distant. One read the protocol aloud, voice monotone, as if reciting weather conditions. You will be escorted to the chamber. You may speak to your legal counsel or spiritual advisor if you wish. Do you have any final requests? Elias shook his head slowly. No, he said. Just make sure they're watching. The guard paused. Who? Elias smiled faintly. The world. They shackled his wrists and ankles, the cold metal biting into skin. As they led him down the corridor, Elias counted the steps, not because he was nervous, but because he had memorized them over the years. 112 steps from his cell to the execution chamber. He wondered if the senator had counted anything in his final moments. Outside, reporters gathered behind barricades. Satellite vans lined the road like a parade of steel insects. News anchors rehearsed solemn expressions, adjusting ties and microphones. Social media buzzed with hashtags. Hashtag Justice Serve. Hashtag Free Elias. Hashtag Whitman Verdict. No one agreed on the truth anymore. Inside the observation room, witnesses took their seats. Journalists, officials, victims, relatives. Among them was Mara Whitman, the senator's daughter. Her jaw was tight, her hands clenched. She had imagined this moment for years, believing it would bring closure. She was wrong. Elias was strapped to the chair, leather restraints secured with practiced efficiency. A needle hovered near his arm, filled with a clear liquid that promised silence. Any last words? The warden asked. Elias lifted his head, eyes scanning the glass beyond which the witnesses sat. This isn't justice, he said calmly. It's convenience, and you'll understand that soon enough. The executioner nodded. The signal was given. The injection began. And then the power went out. Lights snapped off. Screens went black. Gasps filled the room as emergency alarms failed to sound. For 3 seconds, Blackwater Correctional Facility was swallowed by darkness. When the lights returned, Elias Crow was still alive and smiling. The blackout lasted exactly 11 seconds. That was all it took. By the time backup generators kicked in, chaos had already ignited. Medical staff rushed forward. Guards shouted conflicting orders. The injection was halted, protocols broken, rules shattered. And somewhere in those 11 seconds, everything changed. Elias coughed violently, chest heaving as oxygen flooded back into his lungs. The sedative had entered his bloodstream, but not enough. Not enough to silence him. Stop, he gasped. You need to stop. The warden hesitated. Procedures did not cover this. I have evidence, Elias continued, voice weak but urgent. Real evidence. The kind you buried. The The kind that proves who really killed Whitman. Laughter would have been easier, but no one laughed. In the observation room, Mara Whitman stood abruptly. Her heart pounded, confusion replacing years of certainty. "He's lying," someone muttered. "A last-minute stunt," said another. But the journalists leaned forward. Cameras, now running on internal batteries, caught everything. Elias turned his head toward the glass. "Check the offshore accounts," he said. "The shell companies tied to Project Helios. My execution won't erase them." That name, Project Helios, hit the room like a shockwave. It was classified. The execution was officially suspended. Within hours, the footage leaked. Within days, the world was on fire. Investigative journalists dug into the name Elias had spoken. At first, nothing surfaced. Then a financial anomaly. Then a whistleblower. Then documents, thousands of them, exposing an international web of corruption involving energy contracts, political assassinations, and corporate influence. Senator Whitman's name appeared again and again, not as a victim, but as a broker. Elias Crow, it turned out, had been an analyst, a man who saw patterns others ignored. He had discovered that Whitman was preparing to expose Project Helios himself, not out of morality, but leverage. Someone else had beaten him to it, and Elias had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps the right place. Public opinion shifted with terrifying speed. Protests erupted outside embassies. Hashtags reversed themselves. Governments issued carefully worded denials. Mara Whitman watched the news from her apartment. The world she knew collapsing around her. Her father, the hero, the martyr, was becoming something else entirely. She remembered Elias's eyes. Not guilty. She requested a meeting. When she entered the holding room weeks later, Elias looked thinner, weaker, but resolute. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked. "I did," Elias replied softly. No one wanted to listen. Silence stretched between them. Outside that room, nations trembled. The world did not wake up the same after the failed execution. Something invisible had cracked. A thin fracture running through institutions that had once seemed immovable. Courts convened emergency sessions. Networks suspended normal programming. Governments issued statements that said nothing and meant even less. The name Elias Crow was spoken in living rooms, classrooms, and cabinet meetings, not as a criminal, but as a question no one could easily answer. The retrial was scheduled under impossible pressure. International observers arrived first, followed by human rights delegations, forensic accountants, and journalists who treated the courthouse like a war zone. Every entrance was guarded, every hallway monitored, every document scanned and rescanned. Justice, when finally summoned, arrived dragging the weight of the entire world behind it. Elias was transferred to a secure holding facility 3 days before proceedings began. The irony was not lost on him. He was safer now than he had been as a condemned man. Guards spoke carefully, almost respectfully. Doctors checked his vitals twice a day. The chair that had nearly killed him existed now only in memory, though it visited him often at night. On the first morning of trial, Elias stood before the mirror and studied his reflection. He looked older than his years, older than the man who had walked into Blackwater 7 years earlier. Survival had aged him more than fear ever could. He adjusted the collar of his shirt and whispered a single reminder to himself. Tell the truth. Let it burn. The courtroom erupted when he entered. Cameras flashed despite strict orders. The judge banged the gavel repeatedly, her expression carved from discipline and exhaustion. This trial was not about spectacle. She reminded everyone. It was about facts. The irony settled like dust. The prosecution began cautiously, their original narrative already reduced to rubble. They acknowledged procedural failures, investigative gaps, and conflict of interest. Each admission landed like a small explosion. The defense did not object. They waited. Then the documents appeared. Project Helios unfolded across massive digital screens. Financial trails, encrypted messages, shell corporations stacked like hollow dolls. The room watched as timelines aligned with terrifying precision. Senator Whitman's public speeches contrasted sharply with private communications, arranging payoffs, leverage, and silence. Elias testified on the third day. He spoke calmly, clearly, explaining how he had discovered the anomalies while doing contract analysis, how he had flagged them, how his warnings were ignored. He described the night of the murder in exact detail, not with drama but with accuracy. He named the people who had been with him, the calls he had made, the files he had accessed. When asked why he had stayed silent for so long, Elias paused. "Because truth doesn't survive without witnesses," he said. "And I had none until the world was forced to watch me almost die." Mara Whitman attended every session. At first she sat rigid, her face locked behind years of inherited certainty. But certainty eroded quickly. Each piece of evidence stripped something away, not just from her father's legacy, but from her own understanding of loyalty and justice. She listened, she learned, and she mourned someone she realized she had never truly known. When she was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke of her father as a parent, not a politician, of dinners missed and promises made, of the man who believed power justified secrecy. Her voice broke only once. "If my father was part of this," she said, "then justice demands a truth, not revenge." Outside, protests swelled and shifted.